So I'm going to move into some details. And, as Jerry mentioned, I have over 40 publications out there in the peer-reviewed literature on just the epithelium of the cornea. And that was before there was any OCT or any ultrasound FDA or CE approved. So this is before it was commercialized. We managed to get, how do you do that? There's no technology in the world that has been put into the market with this much evidence already in the peer-reviewed literature. None in my lifetime that I've seen. Now, how did that happen? Well, it's because everyone ignored epithelium for all these years. And so, if you don't have access to something, you don't have an incentive to have an interest in it. And so it gave me a massive runway, and I'm grateful for the runway from a career standpoint, but it's been a frustrating standpoint. And I think ArcScan, and I can tell you, because I've been through the whole story with them, it has been a very difficult pathway, and they've had some incredibly challenging times to get this machine onto market. And so I think we need to be, all of us, extremely appreciative of particularly Andy, who really came into the company when it was really struggling many years ago. And as an engineer and a business, they're trying to do just everything at once, and getting this thing to the finish line, and not only to the finish line, but where we are now, which is a super easy to use, affordable, technology that can really fit into any practice and can be used by anybody. So let's look at some details, because Jerry mentioned, measuring epithelium with OCT. And, the fact is that the OCT is not just measuring the epithelium. It's measuring the epithelium and the tear film, because it doesn't resolve the tear film from the epithelium. Now, obviously, ultrasound does, because when you immerse the eye, now the first interface is the surface of the epithelium, right? Not even the mucin layer is included. It's the cellular wall that makes the echo, not the mucin layer. So ultrasound is actually measuring the epithelial thickness. OCT is measuring the epithelium with the tear film. And we all know that the tear film can vary tremendously. Here's a perfect example. Look at the epithelial map from my MS-39 from CSO. And this is when the patient presented for a pre-op exam. And this is a month after we instigated warm compresses in meibomian gland dysfunction measures. The tear film became much more stable, much more amenable, let's say, to having surgery. But look how the epithelial map on the same color scale completely changed. So that's because now we have a healthy, even, robust tear film. And so, you might look at this and say there's a donut shape, but actually once you, fix the tear film, suddenly everything looks a lot more normal. Now we looked at these differences when the RT View came out, and I had one of the prototypes way before it was commercialized in 2015. I had a prototype from 2012. And along with the approvals, we had published this paper showing the differences in epithelial thicknesses between the RT View and the Insight. And you can see that in the center, there's very little average difference. But once you get to the 3 millimeter zone, you start to get significant differences. And remember that in keratoconus, the cones are, they're in the 2 to 3 to 4 millimeter zone. So it's the 1, 2, 3 micron differences in the epithelial profile. It's those small micronic differences that are going to tell you whether a cornea is keratoconic or not. And so sadly, OCT with its great accuracy, but inferior accuracy, will sometimes miss these very early cones, because it doesn't have the resolution to pick up these incredibly small differences. And that's pre-op. If we look at post-op and we compared post-LASIK OCT and ultrasound, same eyes, now you can see rather large differences in measurements between the two. And our paper goes into the physics of why these things are occurring, but just in a nutshell, it's because refractive index changes occur, and therefore the epithelium is much thicker post-op. And now the refractive index that's used by OCT to calculate the thickness makes for this kind of inaccuracy. Whereas in ultrasound, we don't have that issue because the speed of sound doesn't change before and after, LASIK in epithelium. So, in terms of accuracy, ultrasound will always have the upper hand because we don't have measures for refractive index to have in every single eye, which is what you need to match the accuracy, as well as being able to resolve the tear film, which might be one day possible by even higher resolution OCT, but still. Okay, so what is the normal epithelium thickness? This is one of those wonderful stories of a paper that was sent to, this is an anatomy paper, right? This is the epithelium of the human cornea. This is 2008. We're into the 21st century, and there hasn't been an anatomy paper published in eyes probably for 100 years since a German ophthalmologist has presented it, since Vogt presented some anatomical Vogt's Stria or something. And here we are with an anatomy paper, and I thought, well, I can't send this to just a specialist journal. I've got to send this to ophthalmology, because ophthalmology is like, this is anatomy, this is real, this is big. After a 6 months back and forth with reviewers who were, just not conversant in ultrasound, and despite the senior section editor, well, he basically went with the reviewers, and I was really, I kind of said, okay. I sent this to George Waring when he was editor of the JRS, and I said, look, here are the reviews, and here's the paper. What do you think? He said, I'll accept it right now. I've got the reviews. I don't have to re-review it. I agree with all of your rebuttals. And it was published a month later. This paper has cost ophthalmology a lot of, what are they called? What's it called when your paper is referenced? Citations. What we found was that the epithelium is not one thickness, as is in all of the textbooks. All the textbooks say that the epithelium is a uni-thickness 50 micron layer. And we found that the center was about 50 microns, okay, but we found that there was a 6 micron superior to inferior and about a 1 micron nasal to temporal difference, and that the pattern was mirrored. It was different from right and left eyes, but it was the same in a mirrored fashion. And all of this is explained in my lectures on epithelium, but needless to say, it's all to do with eyelid anatomy and how the eye blinks. We blink 10,000 times a day, and how the chafing and how the forces work on the epithelium. Jerry mentioned our Ortho-K paper, which shows that if you change the eyelid for a hard lens, you move the epithelium around in a different way. So the eyelid has a very important function in determining the epithelial thickness profile. So I want to really concentrate on the keratoconus screening thing, because as you can see, we published these papers quite a few years ago now, but we've been using them since 2004 when I first had the idea. And I'm going to go through the theory of this. It's quite simple. If we think of a schematic here of a normal cornea with the front surface, the stromal surface, and the back surface, and the epithelium is what's between the front and back, front surface of the epithelium and front surface of the stroma. In the case of keratoconus, where the front and back surfaces are bulging, what we know is that the epithelium compensates for that bulge. And so you get thinning of the epithelium over the cone, and you get a relative thickening around that zone, which makes it look a bit like a donut shape. And that's what we normally see. But you see, what we, the step forward was to understand why it was that we were still arguing on the podium as to whether the orb scan was better than a relative, just an anterior segment, an anterior surface topography for detecting keratoconus. And those of us were saying, yes, because the back surface changes first. And you had all these people saying, no, it doesn't, blah, blah, blah. And we were both right. We were both right. The back surface can change first, because the epithelium can completely absorb earlier changes of the front surface of the stroma. So we were right in that the front surface topography doesn't change, and the others were right without realizing it, that it was the stromal surface moving forward, but not visible because of the epithelial compensation. So the compensation can be complete, and therefore you can get an absolutely normal anterior surface topography in a keratoconic eye. And when you think that these back surface abnormalities are so small now, because they're being absorbed by the epithelium fully, that they may be lost in the soup. You have an algorithm that tells you, oh, that bulge in the back surface is really keratoconus. Well, if it's really small, the algorithm might say, low probability. But if you look at the epithelium right over the spot where the back surface is elevated, now you've got confirmation that the back and front surfaces are yoked and that there's an extrusion, and therefore the epithelium is the decider in these early cases. And I will show you how just incredibly sensitive the epithelium is at doing this. Now, I was showing this for a few years and I was completely ignored again, as one is. And, Schopenhauer said that the three stages of truth are that the first stage is that you're completely ignored. The second stage is that you're violently opposed. And the third stage is accepted as inherently obvious. And we're at that stage now because it's obvious that the epithelium will hide cones. But here is where OptoView started their program on epithelial mapping, is when I did a study showing that you could have epithelium that was thicker inferiorly, and it was the epithelium that was providing the inferior steepening on the topography, not the stroma. And when I showed that, and I showed that you actually had basically a pseudo keratoconic topography, and we did a 1,500 eye study where we showed that basically our LASIK, we showed that we could exclude keratoconus 84% of the time that the topography was abnormal. 84% of the time we could do LASIK on that patient because we had proof that it wasn't keratoconus. Suddenly, because your LASIK volumes increased by 7%, that means money, and money means you should have a device because it can make you money. And that's when OptoView started their epithelial mapping on OCT. Of course, we were kind of a little behind the curve here commercializing it because this device is a lot more complex than an OCT, and cheaper, by the way. So kind of paradoxically. But we'd gone through the phase of showing that the more severe the keratoconus, the thinner the epithelium over the cone, and the thicker the surrounding donut is. We'd essentially obviously been able to show that there's a difference in keratoconus and normal epithelial profiles, obviously. But the question was exploiting this. And so Ron Silverman and I applied for a NIH grant. We got several $1 million to do this. It was a very difficult project. Fred Litzy is one of the last papers he was on. He was one of the geniuses of ultrasound science in the world. And we developed an algorithm. Now this algorithm is now on board on the inside. And as you can see, the sensitivity, the pickup rate of keratoconus, and once it picks it up, the specificity is higher than any topography device in the world. And you can include every algorithm on the planet, Bell and Ambrosio, whatever you want. They don't have this sensitivity and specificity. And the reason for that is that if you can measure the epithelium with 1 micron precision, you can detect focal changes in the epithelium that shouldn't be in that region in a case where 1 or 2 microns difference on a front or back surface is going to get lost in the soup of the noise of topography and tomography. So it's very clear why epithelium is more sensitive. And now it's just a question of people, incorporating it into their practices. So use, and this by, I'm just pointing out here, this is detecting epithelium. Like if you were just screening for refractive surgery only using epithelial maps, not using any topography, you'd still do better than with topography and tomography, which is, quite amazing if you think about it. So here's some examples. I mean, we have here an example of a topography that looks suspect and a tomography that looks suspect. So it's suspect, the atlas is saying it's 72% normal, but we all know that looks a bit weird. We look at the back surface on the bell in Ambrosio, and indeed the BAD is quite high. And now we're thinking, well, this probably is keratoconus. But here you go. Here's the high frequency ultrasound map, of course, 10 millimeters of epithelium. OCT never gets 10 millimeters, maximum maybe 8 or 9. But there you see the thinning, the focal thinning over the point where the back surface is elevated. And here's an example where the OCT has been good enough and we didn't have to do an ultrasound. We didn't have to do an ultrasound. But here's an example where you have normal topography but suspect back surface. And here is completely normal anterior surface. I mean, other than the fact that the keratometry is very high. In a patient with 20/16 vision, although a high myope. But this is the back surface of this cornea. And the BAD is huge, right? It's like alarm bell, 15 alarm bells, keratoconus, right? But here's the epithelial map of this cornea. And you can see that there is no focal thinning over where you would expect there to be, a donut, and like none. And here is the RSK, the Reinstein-Silverman keratoconus algorithm. And you can see that we, with the epithelium, can be very confident that this is not keratoconus. The back surface is in a weird shape for a different reason. Who knows? Maybe it's Fuchs, maybe it's something else, but it's not keratoconus, okay? So this is an extreme example. Here's another one, but this is the scary type. This is the part where you say the ectasia without a cause. So you have normal topography, totally normal. You have normal back surface, according to the algorithms, totally normal. But the epithelium shows focal thinning, okay? Focal thinning. And the standard deviation map, in other words, the pattern deviation to the population shows, actually, this is thinner inferiorly than expected. And the RSK is no ticket for corneal refractive surgery. Actually, as Jerry showed earlier, rather, why don't you preserve this patient's vision by a transepithelial cross-linking or a cross-linking, and then put an ICL in using your high frequency ultrasound device to get the highest safety for sizing. So these are the, oh my goodness moments, right? Where you're like, whoa, I just saved myself a huge headache, and I just saved a patient years of rehabilitation. So this is an incredibly old slide, but this was what I was using to argue back then in 2006. I was saying, look, you can have totally normal topographies and donut shapes under these topographies, and you can avoid ectasias in these cases using the difference between epithelium of keratoconic and normal corneas. But you can even better from a commercial standpoint, in terms of justifying the expense of ultrasound and the hassle, you have keratoconic suspects from topography that can be excluded from having keratoconus. And you can go ahead and do the case by exploiting the differences in epithelial profile differences. So again, it can't be emphasized too much how powerful this is. So I'm going to go through a quick little application, which has enabled me to do a hell of a lot less clear lens exchange on hyperobes. And that is the fact that the epithelium changes as expected, thinner over the steeper area and thicker over the carved out area of a hyperopic ablation. But I'm going to show you how hyperopic LASIK has been made way safer by epithelial mapping than by just looking at keratometry. So here's the post-op the maximum simulating K post-op, and obviously the epithelial thickness is thinner the higher the K. and the donut part is thicker, the higher the K, obviously. But look at this example. Here's a patient who has a keratometry of 41 diopters, but the epithelium is already at 26, and we know that the epithelium starts breaking down at about 21 microns. So doing an enhancement of a +1 in this patient is not possible. So it's contraindicated. And yet, from the standard rules, you would say, oh yeah, I can do a +1 in this undercorrection because the cornea is still flat. But you'd be wrong. You'd be creating an apex syndrome in this cornea. Likewise, here's a very steep cornea where it's not 50 yet. So you say, oh, look, I can do an enhancement. It's only 49. I can go up to 50. And the answer is no, you can't. The epithelium is already minimum at 26. On the other hand, and this is how our paper was born, here's, a SIM-K, SIM-K of, sorry, I'm just taking my image out of the way here, of 52 with an epithelium of still 36. And I can certainly do a +1 enhancement on this eye, no problem. Likewise here, I can take this 44 diopter cornea and do a +3 enhancement after a +6 and total +9. Of course I can do that because I've got plenty of epithelial space to be steepening this cornea further physiologically in this eye. And we've published several papers on this and apical syndrome and the dynamics and the probability of epithelium not stabilizing. So we published almost 800 eyes with 2 years follow-up, +4 to +7. And we demonstrated the same accuracy and the same, and actually better safety than clear lens exchange, because clear lens exchange has a 2 to 3% loss of 2 lines because of capsular and IOL, issues, optical issues. We get better safety, if you like, with LASIK than we do with clear lens exchange and high hyperopia, but only because we're using epithelial mapping. Super accurate, cylinder control is excellent, cyclotorsion control. And it's all because it's to do with the fact that a flat cornea with thin epithelium can't have an enhancement, and a steep cornea with thick epithelium can have an enhancement. And being able to do epithelial mapping is the key to avoiding 2 intraocular surgeries with less, with a lot more risk, and just doing LASIK on the cornea. And there are many excimer lasers now on the market that do excellent hyperopic ablations for high hyperopia. But let me move on to the more esoteric, but the scariest part and the most important part of epithelial applications. And that is to do with what we called, my ARVO poster in 1994, the law of epithelial compensation. And so if you just memorize this, if there is irregular astigmatism, there is irregular epithelium. That's the law. In other words, if an eye presents with irregular topography, by definition, the epithelium has reached its maximum compensatory function, leaving irregularity on the surface, which now is showing as irregular astigmatism. It's very logical. So there can be no such thing as an irregular cornea with regular epithelium. Okay, so another way of doing that graphically is to show that you can have 3 front surfaces that are identical with 3 completely different subsurfaces. So the stromal surface can be different even though the topography is the same. And therefore topography or wavefront are inaccurate means of assessing complex corneas. And I know I've developed a reputation for fixing very weird corneas, but it's not out of, greater skill than anybody else. I would say it's about having more information than anybody else. And having epithelial mapping throughout my career has been my catapult into therapeutic refractive surgery, and hence why I'm somewhat ahead of the game. I want to show you 4 examples of where the topography just doesn't give you the information. So here's an example of an incomplete nasal flap with a double ablation on the flap, but this is the topography with a truncation. Here's a relatively normal but slightly irregular topography in a patient with multiple procedures. That was actually, no one knew what this was. I was told, it was sent to me as an ectasia, but I diagnosed it as a decentered hyperopic ablation with the centration put here. And this is post-RK 20 years later with 6 lines loss of best spectacle corrected vision. Now, this is all the information you have on the front surface. Let's look at the epithelium underneath those 4 maps. Now look over here. You have a highly irregular epithelium in the region of the short flap. Look here. You've got rings of thick, thin epithelium underneath that surface. Look at this RK. Very thin epithelium top and bottom, very thick along this way, tons of cylinder in the epithelium, which you don't see, pardon me, which you don't see on the topography, right? The topography looks regular, but the surface of the stroma is highly irregular. And here's the decentered hyperopic PRK showing the donut of epithelium with thinner epithelium here. That you can't tell that from the topography. So suddenly the epithelial maps are starting to give you more diagnosis, and then the B scans even more information. So here's the thick, thin, right? In this epithelial map. Here's the short flap with a double ablation with a compensation zone of epithelium that's going to screw up your topography guided treatment big time. Here's your RK. Well, you can see the incisions down here. And here's your decentered hyperopic PRK, where you can see, the Bowman's is missing in the center, in the visual axis. That tells you that there was ablation of the stroma in the visual axis. So PTK, as you all know, takes sheets of epithelium and once it cracks through the epithelium, it starts taking stroma. And, there's now a 6-hour course on therapeutic refractive surgery, which ends with this slide. And the fact is that if you have irregular topography and you have irregular epithelium, you cannot do a topography guided treatment. You have to do a transepithelial PTK, and you can smooth the stromal surface, regularize the epithelium, produce a much better topography, reduce the wavefront errors, and increase the contrast of this eye from very low normal to completely high normal. And that's just with a PTK, and that's because we had the diagnosis. And this case was done in 2006. So just think about how we were thinking way back then, and this is still news because epithelial mapping has not been widely used. There's the intraoperative ablation predicted epithelial removal pattern, and that's what we had at that stage of the ablation. And we can see that we predicted what the epithelium was going to look like exactly by accurate measurements pre-op. And this is the difference in stroma before and after, showing rings of stroma removed. You can't remove rings of stroma with no matter how good your eye tracker is. That is a very difficult ablation to do. And I'm going to finish off with this section with our Louvre gallery of our beautiful tableaus of PTK. And this is just PTK. So highly irregular short flaps regularized. This is a highly irregular surface here, regularized with 1 PTK. Here's the other eye of the same eye, highly irregular epithelial thickness pattern, regularized again. And this is what the patient saw before surgery with their best corrected around the light. They drew this. And this is after 1 PTK, now they're drawing this. So again, not topography guided, not wavefront guided. So the opposite of what a lot of the companies are making you think that, oh, this fixes all the problems. It's like, no, it fixes all the problems unless the epithelium is irregular. If the epithelium is irregular, you've got to plan your PTK anatomically, and you can fix these things, what used to be thought of as insurmountable problems. You can fix them very easily with a PTK. And let's be clear, the Vizix 2020B in 1995 was approved for PTK, and that's an old technology. Here's an example of a central island. There was a drop of water on the ablation. It was an inexperienced surgeon. He did all the ablation on his Vizix, and he got this topography post-op. And the patient arrived and we mapped his epithelium, and with a transepithelial PTK, one go, I mean, we didn't completely get rid of it, but we got rid of it on the surface, and we completely regularized this horrific topography. And now we were able to do another treatment to be able to give the patient the vision that they wanted. That's the difference map of a transepithelial PTK, not a topography guided treatment. And here's another example of a horrendous topography regularized beautifully with this difference map, and the difference map showing exactly the mirror image of the pre-op by looking at the epithelial profile. So, you know, I could go on forever about cornea and epithelium, and I do sometimes. So I'm just going to move now on to phakic IOLs.